All names, places, and institutions are aliases used to protect privacy. Procedures and timelines reflect real-world law, and forensics for immersion. The hum of the air vents in Granite County Superior Court was so constant that most people stopped hearing it after a few minutes. But on this day, every sound seemed sharpened. The scrape of a chair, the shuffle of a clerk's papers, the soft buzz of the fluorescent lights. Attorney North sat at the defense table, spine straight, a yellow legal pad in front of her filled with tight handwriting and color-coded tabs. She had stood in this courtroom many times, but never with stakes like these. Beside her, Defendant Rook. Prison khakis, traded that morning for a too large grey blazer, kept his eyes fixed on a single knot in the wood grain of the table, as if looking anywhere else would break whatever fragile thread had brought them here. This was not a trial, not exactly. It was a post-conviction evidentiary hearing on a motion to vacate judgment, a narrow legal doorway that rarely opened. 15 years earlier, in this same courtroom, a jury had found Rook guilty of a brutal sexual assault and kidnapping. The victim, witness Eden, had pointed at him from the stand and said, with a voice that shook but did not waver, "It was him." Judge Keystone had pronounced sentence, 20 years, and the deputies had led Rook away. The system had declared him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, the same system was being asked to admit it had been wrong. In the gallery, there was a muted tension. A few law students from Riverbend Law Clinic huddled with notebooks, ready to capture every phrase. 2 reporters sat in the back row, one from the Riverbend Herald, the other from a statewide outlet that covered criminal justice. At the far end of the first row, Eden sat with her hands clenched around a folded tissue, her shoulders pulled tight as if bracing for impact. She had come back willingly to the same courtroom where she'd once helped convict him. This time, she would say something very different. Rook's gaze flicked once toward the door that led back to holding. The habit was ingrained. Every court appearance in his life had ended with that door. Shackles, metal detectors, the long drive back to Iron Ridge Correctional Facility. It took effort to remember that this hearing held the possibility of a different exit, through the front doors, into open air. That possibility rested improbably on 2 things that had stayed intact over 15 years, a sealed envelope in a crime lab freezer and the conscience of the woman who had once sworn he was her attacker. Judge Keystone entered. Robe trailing, grey hair thinner than it had been on sentencing day, but posture still upright. This matter is on for an evidentiary hearing on Defendant Rook's motion to vacate his conviction pursuant to the state's post-conviction DNA statute and newly discovered evidence doctrine, he intoned. His voice bounced softly off the panelled walls. Counsel, appearances for the record. North rose. Attorney North for Defendant Rook, Your Honor. Across the aisle, a man in a dark suit stood. Prosecutor Hale for the state, Your Honor. Not the same prosecutor who had tried the original case. Prosecutor Slate had retired years ago, but Hale carried the weight of the office now. Very well, Keystone said. Counsel, you may proceed. North stood fully, feeling the familiar click in her knee as she stepped forward. This was the moment she had prepared for, down to the sequence of exhibits and the phrasing of each question. But beneath the rehearsal was something raw and personal. 15 years ago, she had been Rook's public defender, a young attorney with too many cases and not enough leverage. She had watched him get convicted on evidence she had always felt was thinner than it looked. She had filed the appeal that went nowhere. When she left the public defender's office, his was one of the case files she had taken home in a cardboard box, unable to bring herself to send it to storage. Your Honor, she began, we are here because the evidence that convicted my client has been irreparably undermined by 2 developments that did not exist at the time of trial. First, Advanced DNA testing that was unavailable 15 years ago has conclusively excluded him as the source of the biological material recovered from the victim's body and has identified another man. Second, the state's star witness, victim Eden, has recanted her identification and provided a credible explanation for how her original testimony was influenced. Together, these facts establish what the law calls an actual innocence gateway. They do more than raise doubt. They show that the wrong man has been in prison for 15 years. A murmur rippled through the rows. Keystone raised a hand. Silence returned. As the hearing began in earnest, one unresolved detail hovered like a ghost over everything. It was the question that had quietly nagged from the beginning of the case, a detail small enough to be ignored at trial, but stubborn enough not to disappear. On the night of the attack, Eden had told the responding officer that she scratched her attacker's neck hard enough to draw blood. The nurse examiner had dutifully taken scrapings from beneath her fingernails and sealed them in the sexual assault kit. At trial, no one had ever explained what happened to that potential DNA goldmine. It was logged at Arcadia Lab, then lost in the backlog and never tested. For years, that untested scrap of evidence sat in the dark, waiting to contradict the story everyone thought they knew. If stories like this fascinate you, if you want to understand how the justice system can declare someone guilty and years later admit it was wrong, remember to subscribe and share your thoughts. These cases are complex, and every perspective helps unpack what went wrong and how to fix it. 15 years earlier, the night that started, everything was cold enough that breath hung in the air like smoke. It was just after midnight in Riverbend, a city of old brick warehouses and narrow streets that emptied quickly once the bars closed. On Crescent Avenue, the neon sign of the Blue Lantern Diner flickered as the last customers paid and left. Inside, Eden wiped down the counter, her back aching from the double shift. She clocked out at 12:07 a.m., grabbed her purse and pushed through the back door into the alley. The alley behind the Blue Lantern was the kind of place people stepped into only because they had to. A narrow cut between buildings, lit by a single street lamp half a block away, its bulb more amber than white. Two dumpsters sat opposite each other, lids propped open. The asphalt was patched and pitted, slick with a thin sheen of oil in places. Somewhere a bottle rolled and clinked. Eden shifted her purse strap higher on her shoulder and quickened her pace, keys threaded through her fingers like makeshift claws. She noticed the man only when he was already moving toward her. He stepped out from behind one of the dumpsters, a shape in a dark jacket with a reflective stripe on the sleeve that caught the weak light in a thin flash. He said something, words she would later struggle to recall precisely, but the tone was controlled, almost calm. Then he was on her. A hard hand over her mouth, the press of a body pinning her against cold brick, the metallic smell of sweat and machine oil. She tried to scream, to bite, to twist away. He hit her once, a short, brutal blow to the cheekbone that made her vision pop white. When he forced her to the ground, her knees scraped raw on the asphalt. She raked her nails across his neck, feeling skin give, something warm on her fingers. A door opened at the far end of the alley. The diner's dishwasher, employee Latch, stepped out with a trash bag in one hand and a cigarette in the other. He heard a muffled cry and froze. "Hey!" he shouted into the dark. The attacker jerked his head toward the sound, hissed a curse, and pushed off her. A moment later he was gone, shoes pounding away into the maze of back streets. Latch found Eden half sitting, half collapsed against the wall, uniform torn, face already swelling. She clutched her blouse together with both hands, shaking. He called 911 with fingers that didn't seem to want to work. Paramedics arrived within minutes, lights painting the brick walls red and blue. In the emergency room at Riverbend General Hospital, a sexual assault nurse examiner, Nurse Willow, performed a standard forensic exam. She photographed bruises, documented Eden's injuries, a split lip, bruises along her throat, abrasions on her knees and elbows. She took vaginal and cervical swabs, anal swabs, oral swabs, external genital swabs, and scrapings from under Eden's fingernails. She bagged Eden's clothing, underwear, stockings, blouse, in separate paper bags to prevent mold. Every item was labeled, sealed with evidence tape, and placed into a standardized sexual assault evidence kit box. The kit left the hospital with a uniformed officer and was signed into evidence at the Riverbend Police Department property room. The chain of custody started there, a simple log sheet noting date, time, and each person who handled the box. Within 48 hours, the kit was transported to Arcadia Lab, the regional crime laboratory that serviced Granite County and several neighboring jurisdictions. There, a clerk logged it into the electronic tracking system, assigned it a barcode, and placed it in a walk-in freezer set at -80 degrees Celsius. Detective Harbour caught the case when his phone buzzed at 2:15 a.m. He was a veteran in the Violent Crimes Unit, a man whose file drawers were lined with solved assaults and robberies, the result of a methodical mind and a willingness to work long hours. He walked the alley just after dawn, coffee in one hand, a notebook in the other. The crime scene was already technically cold. Foot traffic, wind, and emergency responders had disturbed whatever trace evidence might have been there. But Harbour documented what he could. There were no obvious shoe prints. The irregular asphalt made impression casting impossible. No weapon lay discarded. The dumpsters offered smudged fingerprints, too partial to be useful. Harbour's initial theory was straightforward. Stranger sexual assault in a commercial alley after midnight. No obvious robbery motive. Given the reflective stripe on the jacket and the smell of oil, he wondered if the attacker worked in one of the nearby warehouses or auto shops. He canvassed businesses within a 5-block radius, asking about late-shift employees. He checked open cases for similar assaults. A pattern emerged. 3 months earlier, in a neighboring county, a young woman leaving a laundromat after closing had been grabbed in an alley, choked, and nearly dragged into a van. She had escaped when a neighbor turned on a porch light. The attacker had worn a dark jacket and smelled of gasoline. There were no names attached to that case, no suspect identified. Harbour requested the file anyway. Back at the hospital, once Eden had been examined and allowed to shower, Harbour took her statement. She sat in a gown, a blanket around her shoulders despite the heat of the room. Her voice was hoarse. Harbour asked open-ended questions. "Tell me what you remember." She described the alley, the hand over her mouth, the strike to her face. When he asked whether she saw his face, she hesitated. "It was dark," she said. I saw pieces. Jawline, maybe facial hair, I don't know. I remember the jacket more. Dark, with something shiny on the sleeve." "Could you recognize him if you saw him again?" Harbour asked. Maybe," she said. "I'm not sure." It was an honest answer, and a fragile one. Harbour worked the lead about the reflective stripe. 2 days later, an officer on patrol mentioned a man he'd seen hanging around Crescent Avenue over the past month, often near the diner's back door. Not doing anything illegal, just there, smoking, sometimes talking to the kitchen staff. The officer had run him off once. The man's name was Rook. He lived in a basement apartment about 3 miles away and worked as a maintenance assistant at a warehouse on the outskirts of town. Harbour pulled Rook's old incident reports. 2 years before, Rook had been cited for trespassing behind a closed electronics store. The owner had complained about a guy always lurking back there at night. No charges had stuck. The report noted that Rook said he liked to walk when he couldn't sleep and had cut through alleys to avoid main streets. The booking photo showed a young man with a neutral expression, dark hair, light stubble on his jaw. Harbour decided to bring him in. The interview room at the sheriff's office was small, with cinder block walls painted a colour that might once have been white. no windows, a table bolted to the floor, 2 plastic chairs. In 2009, Granite County did not require the recording of non-homicide interrogations. A video camera sat dark in the corner, unused. Harbour read Rook his Miranda rights from a laminated card. Rook signed the waiver form, saying he understood and was willing to talk. At first, the conversation was conversational. Rook said he lived alone, worked full-time, and kept mostly to himself. On the night of the assault, he claimed, he had been at home watching a movie. When Harbour asked which movie, he said he couldn't remember. When Harbour asked whether anyone had been with him, he said no. Harbour asked whether he ever walked near Crescent Avenue. Rook hesitated, then admitted that sometimes he did, that he liked the energy of the street even late, that the diner light made the night feel less empty. After 2 hours, the tone shifted. Harbour pressed harder. He returned to inconsistencies, to gaps in Rook's story. "You go for walks to clear your head," Harbour said. "You like alleys. You live 3 miles from where a woman was attacked. You have no alibi. Help me understand why you're not the man who did this." The interview went on for almost 5 hours. There was no break recorded in any log, no notation of food offered. At some point, Rook rubbed his forehead and said, "Maybe I walked down that street that night. I don't remember exactly. I have trouble sleeping a lot." Harbour wrote that down as an admission of proximity. Later, he would testify that Rook placed himself near the scene at the relevant time frame. In reality, the time frame had been filled in by Harbour, not Rook. After the interview, Harbour asked for consent to search Rook's apartment. Rook, exhausted and intimidated, signed the form. In the small basement unit, officers found a dark blue work jacket hanging on a hook by the door. On the left sleeve, there was a reflective strip of material, standard issue from the warehouse job, designed to make workers visible around forklifts. Harbour bagged the jacket as evidence. Within 3 days of the assault, Harbour assembled a photo array. He selected 6 photographs, Rook and 5 fillers, matched by race, approximate age, and general appearance. The procedure he used was standard at the time in Granite County, a simultaneous array where all 6 photos were shown to the witness at once. Harbour himself administered it, despite knowing the identity of the suspect. He met Eden in a small room adjacent to the victim witness office. She was still on pain medication, still bruised. Before showing her the photos, Harbour reassured her. "We're doing everything we can to catch this guy," he said. "We have someone in mind, but we need your help to be sure." Those words mattered more than he knew. He slid the array across the table. 6 faces stared up at her, each printed in black and white. Eden's eyes moved from one to another. "Take your time," Harbour said. "The person may or may not be in there." She paused on one photo, Rook's. The dark hair, the jawline. Something about his face seemed more familiar. Or perhaps it was just that, consciously or not, she sensed more of Harbour's attention on that image. She would later describe a feeling that the right answer was there somewhere and that she was supposed to find it. "I think it's this one," she said, pressing the tip of her finger lightly against Rook's picture. "I'm not entirely sure, but I think so." Harbour wrote in his report, "Victim positively identified suspect Rook from a 6-pack photo array." He did not record her hedging language about uncertainty. There was no audio or video of the procedure, no confidence statement collected at the time of identification. The case file made its way to the Granite County District Attorney's office, landing on the desk of Prosecutor Slate. He saw a sympathetic victim, a defendant with no alibi, a suggestive match between clothing and description, and a witness identification. It looked like a triable case. The sexual assault kit, meanwhile, remained logged in Arcadia Lab's freezer. At that time, the lab had a backlog of more than 2,000 untested kits. With limited funds and staff, they triaged. Unsolved stranger rapes with no suspects got priority. Cases like Eden's, where a suspect was already charged, were pushed down the queue. North entered the picture when the court appointed her as Rook's public defender. She was 3 years out of law school, juggling more than 80 open files. When she met Rook in the jail interview room, he maintained his innocence from the first minute. "I didn't touch her," he said. "I swear. They just keep asking me the same questions until I say something they can twist." North listened, took notes, and then did what she could. She filed a motion to compel DNA testing of the sexual assault kit and the fingernail scrapings. Her motion argued that the presence or absence of Rook's DNA on the biological samples would be highly material. If the attacker's semen or skin cells were present and did not match Rook, that would exculpate him. The state opposed. Slate's response brief asserted that the victim's clear identification of the defendant, corroborated by circumstantial evidence, renders DNA testing unnecessary at this time. He argued that the lab's resources should be reserved for cases with no suspects. At the pre-trial hearing, Judge Keystone sided with the state, noting the burden on Arcadia Lab and finding that the defense had not shown testing was reasonably likely to produce exculpatory evidence. In 2009, the law allowed such discretion. The case proceeded to trial without DNA. On the first day, the courtroom was packed. Jury selection took longer than expected. North and Slate both probed jurors' beliefs about eyewitness testimony and police credibility. Several prospective jurors said they believed a victim would never misidentify an attacker, especially in a violent crime. A few admitted they would be inclined to believe police officers. North used her limited peremptory strikes carefully, but could not remove everyone who made her uneasy. Slate opened with a simple story. A young woman attacked while trying to go home from work, a predator who thought the alley would hide him, and a justice system that held him accountable. He emphasized Eden's bravery in coming forward and identifying the man who hurt her. He mentioned the jacket, the late-night walks, the lack of an alibi. "This case is about choices," he told the jury. "The defendant chose to attack. The victim chose to fight. Now you must choose to believe her." Eden testified on the second day. The courtroom seemed to shrink as she took the stand. Slate led her carefully through the night, her shift, the alley, the attack. She cried when she described the moment she realized he might kill her. She mimed the motion of raking her nails across his neck. When Slate asked whether she saw her attacker in the courtroom, she pointed to Rook. "He's there," she said, voice shaking. "I will never forget his face." On cross-examination, North tried to open small cracks without appearing to blame the victim. She asked about the lighting. Eden conceded the alley was dark. She asked how long she had to see the attacker's face. "A second, 2. Eden admitted it had been brief. North brought up the photo array. "When you first saw the photographs, did you tell Detective Harbour you were not entirely sure?" Eden frowned, searching her memory. I said I thought it was him," she replied. "I believed it." North had no recording to impeach her with, no written confidence statement, just her own notes. She shifted to ask whether Eden had been told the police had a suspect before seeing the photos. Eden said she didn't remember. Detective Harbour testified next. He spoke with practiced clarity, walking the jury through his investigation. He described the canvas of the area, the tip about Rook, the interview, the photo array. He testified that Rook had admitted being near the scene on the night in question and could not account for his whereabouts. He showed the jury the jacket, its reflective stripe catching the courtroom lights. On cross, North pressed him on the length of the interrogation and the lack of recording. Harbour responded that policy did not require recording and that he had summarized the interaction accurately in his report. Regarding the photo array, he insisted he had given no feedback or suggestion. The defense case was thin, not for lack of effort, but for lack of resources. North had no expert to challenge the suggestiveness of the identification procedure or to explain the science of memory. She had no funds to send the jacket or Eden's nail scrapings to a private lab. Rook chose not to testify, following her advice. Any misstep, any inconsistent detail, any flash of anger could be used against him. So the jury's last impression was Slate's closing argument, where he contrasted Eden's emotional but steady testimony with Rook's silence. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They sent out one note asking to rehear Eden's testimony about the photo array. The judge reread that portion of the transcript to them, emphasizing her courtroom certainty. At 4:20 p.m. on the second day of deliberations, they returned guilty verdicts on all counts: aggravated sexual assault, kidnapping, and use of a deadly weapon. Judge Keystone later said the words that had echoed in Rook's head for years. "It is the judgment of this court that you be committed to the custody of the Department of Corrections for a term of 20 years. Iron Ridge Correctional Facility sat in a flat patch of land 2 hours north of Riverbend, surrounded by fields and a double ring of chain link topped with razor wire." The first thing that struck Rook was the sound, a constant blend of metallic clanking, shouted conversations drifting down long corridors, the crackle of radios. The second was the smell: disinfectant, sweat, institutional food. Prison life settled into routines that felt rigid and yet always on the verge of chaos. Wake up at 5:30 a.m., count, breakfast in a cavernous hall under buzzing lights, work assignment in the laundry, sorting stained sheets and uniforms, lunch, yard time in a concrete space with a patch of worn grass at its center, lockdown, dinner, lockdown again. Days blurred, marked only by minor variations: an argument over a television channel, a cell search, a fight 2 tiers down that ended in pepper spray and restraints. The human cost of those routines piled up slowly, almost imperceptibly. In his first year, Rook's mother, Mother Leader, visited every other weekend. She brought him news from Riverbend, small comforts like his favorite coffee grounds, which the prison confiscated half the time, and photos of his younger sister, Sister Mara. She always wore her best dress, as if showing the guards she was someone who took care of her family might change the way they looked at her son. The drive was long, but she said it was worth it. "As long as you're in there, I'll be out here waiting." By year 3, her visits dropped to once a month. Her health was worse, and her car less reliable. By year 5, she was gone, felled by a stroke. Rook received the news in a counselor's office. The walls painted a cheerful color that made the words feel even harsher. He requested a temporary furlough to attend the funeral. The warden denied it, citing security concerns and the cost of transport. His mother was buried without him. That empty space in the front row of the chapel belonged to a man in a grey blazer and chain cuffs who never arrived. Letters from Mara slowed, then stopped. She had a child of her own now and lived in another state. The distance was more than physical. For her son's sake, she said in her last letter, she needed to build a life not defined by what happened. Rook could not falter, but the silence hurt. North didn't disappear entirely. For the first 3 years, she handled his direct appeal and a state post-conviction petition. The appeal argued that admitting Eden's shaky identification without proper safeguards violated due process, and that the trial court erred in denying the motion to compel DNA testing. The appellate court's written opinion was polite but firm. It deferred to the jury's credibility assessment, found no abuse of discretion in the trial court's evidentiary rulings, and speculated that DNA testing would have been cumulative at best, given the victim's testimony. The post-conviction petition raised ineffective assistance of counsel, that North had failed by not securing an expert on eyewitness identification. The court rejected that too, noting that public defender budgets are limited and that not calling an expert can be a reasonable strategic decision. Years passed without meaningful movement. Rook filed pro-se motions written in neat but cramped handwriting, citing case names he found in the prison law library. Many were dismissed summarily. He learned the language of the system: successive petition, procedural default, jurisdictional bar, phrases that amounted in practice to closed doors. Yet in the background, the untested kit remained, cold and intact. Arcadia Lab's freezers held thousands like it. Around year 10 of Rook's sentence, a reporter published a series on the backlog crisis, highlighting how sexual assault kits across the state sat on shelves untested while victims waited for answers and suspects went untracked. Public pressure mounted. The legislature responded with a statute requiring inventories of all kits, audits of lab practices, and, crucially, retention of all sexual assault kits for a minimum of 20 years, or the length of any sentence, whichever was longer. The law forbade routine destruction of kits from resolved cases without specific judicial approval. In that new inventory, a technician at Arcadia Lab, Technician Fable, noticed the kit from the Blue Lantern case. The file showed a conviction and no recorded DNA analysis. Fable flagged it with a digital note. Test status: none. Conviction with no DNA. Potential candidate if post-conviction request filed. It was a small act, a few keystrokes that would matter enormously later. Around the same time, North's career shifted. Burned out from juggling public defense caseloads, she moved into private practice, focusing on appeals and post-conviction work. She took with her a dog-eared box of old case files that she could not bring herself to archive. Rook's was on top. On a quiet Sunday, she reopened it. The black and white photos, the trial transcripts, the denial of the DNA motion, all of it still felt wrong in her gut. What had never sat right with her was that unresolved fingernail detail. Eden had testified to scratching the attacker's neck. If she had done so, and if Rook was the attacker, there should have been at least some trace of his DNA under her nails. Back then, it had been easy for the state to say, "We don't know, we didn't test." But now, with a strengthened DNA testing statute on the books, that answer was no longer good enough. North contacted attorney Maple at the Riverbend Innocence Project, an independent clinic run out of Riverbend Law School. Maple specialized in exactly this kind of case, old convictions, with untouched biological evidence. They requested the file from the clerk's office and obtained the Arcadia Lab inventory. Seeing no testing performed in the DNA section of a sexual assault case made Maple raise an eyebrow. "This is exactly what that statute was written for," Maple said. They filed a motion under the state's post-conviction DNA testing law. The statute required the defendant to show that 1. The evidence to be tested was still in existence and in a condition that allowed testing. 2. The evidence hadn't been previously tested in a way that would preclude more advanced testing now. 3. The testing used methods generally accepted in the scientific community. And 4. If the testing produced favorable results, there was a reasonable probability that the defendant would not have been convicted. North's motion checked each box. It also included affidavits from experts in eyewitness identification and forensic science. One, from expert Lumen, explained how short tandem repeat STR DNA profiling had advanced in the 15 years since Rook's trial, allowing full profiles to be generated from smaller, more degraded samples. Lumen noted that modern STR kits used more loci than earlier ones, increasing their discriminatory power astronomically. Another affidavit from expert Sage detailed the known problems with simultaneous photoarrays administered by non-blind officers, citing studies showing increased risk of misidentification. The state initially opposed the motion, arguing again that the jury heard overwhelming evidence of guilt and that testing would be a fishing expedition. But the statutory landscape had changed. After a brief hearing, Judge Keystone granted the motion. His order required Arcadia Lab to locate the sexual assault kit and any related biological evidence, perform STR analysis on the vaginal, cervical, and fingernail samples, and compare the resulting profiles to both Rook and the state's offender database. At Arcadia Lab, analyst Juniper received the assignment. Juniper had been at Arcadia for 8 years, long enough to see protocols tighten and technology leap forward. She removed the Blue Lantern kit from the freezer, verifying the intactness of its evidence seals and checking the chain of custody log. The box had minimal entries: hospital nurse, police property, lab intake, inventory audit. No notations of being opened. In a clean room, under a fume hood, Juniper broke the seals and opened the kit. She laid out the swabs and envelopes one by one. The vaginal, cervical swabs were still in their paper wrappers, dried. The fingernail scrapings were in small, folded bindles. She wore new gloves for each item, changed tools between samples, and documented every step. For each swab, she cut a portion into an extraction tube, added buffers and reagents, and incubated them to release DNA. The extracts were then amplified using a modern STR kit that targeted 20 loci across the human genome. The amplified samples were run through a capillary electrophoresis instrument, which separated the fragments and produced electropherograms, visual peaks representing alleles at each locus. The vaginal swab produced a clear, single-source male profile. So did one of the cervical swabs. The fingernail scrapings yielded a mixed profile, predominantly male, with low-level signals from a female contributor. Eden's own DNA. Juniper compared the profiles to a known sample from Rook, part of his prison intake record. At locus after locus, the alleles did not match. At several loci, Rook had alleles that weren't in the crime scene profile at all, and the profile had alleles he did not possess. This wasn't a partial exclusion, it was a full one. Statistically, the probability that someone unrelated to the true source of the crime scene DNA would match at all loci was less than 1 in 1 quintillion, a number larger than the population of the Earth by many orders of magnitude. In other words, the male DNA in Eden's body and under her nails was not Rook's. Juniper then uploaded the profile to CODIS, the Combined Offender DNA Index System, through the state's portal. The software compared the profile against thousands of convicted offenders in the state's database. A hit came back within hours. Offender Pike, a man currently serving a 30-year sentence for an aggravated sexual assault committed 8 years after the Blue Lantern attack. Pike's case file told a grimly similar story. A woman leaving a late shift at a laundromat grabbed, choked, and assaulted in an alley. Dark jacket, reflective strip. The only difference was that in that later case, the nurse examiner's kit had been promptly tested. Pike had been identified, arrested, and convicted. Had the Blue Lantern kit been tested in 2009, his DNA would have been in CODIS years earlier. The assault that put him in prison might never have happened. Juniper wrote a detailed report and forwarded it to both the DA's office and North. When North saw the exclusion, she closed her office door and sat in silence for a long time. The report was everything they had hoped and feared at once. Proof that Rook had not been the attacker, and proof that the system's failure had likely cost at least one other woman her safety. North and Maple amended their motion, now asking not just for testing, but for vacatur of the conviction, based on newly discovered evidence of actual innocence. The legal standard required them to show that the new evidence, 1, was discovered after trial. 2, could not have been discovered earlier with due diligence, given the state of technology and resources. 3, was not merely cumulative or impeaching, and 4, would probably produce an acquittal if the case were retried. DNA exclusion coupled with a CODIS match to another perpetrator met that standard. Then something unexpected happened. Eden reached out. Through the victim witness coordinator, she requested a meeting with North and Maple. When they sat down in a quiet conference room, she looked older than North remembered. More lines at the corners of her eyes, a different haircut, a different way of carrying herself. But the tremor in her hands when she spoke was the same. "I got the letter about the DNA," she said. "At first I didn't know what to do with it. I had spent so long telling myself that I'd done the right thing, that I testified honestly. But if the man in prison isn't the man who hurt me—" She trailed off, eyes brimming. "I needed to talk to someone who could tell me what that means." North explained the science as gently as possible. DNA doesn't lie. The male genetic material in the kit and under her nails belonged to offender Pike, not Rook. Eden asked if that meant she had lied in court. North chose her words carefully. "You testified to what you believed at the time," she said, "but we now know your identification was mistaken. The law gives you a way to correct that, through a sworn recantation, if you're willing." Eden was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Detective Harbour showed me those photos and told me they had a suspect. I needed to pick someone. I didn't understand how much weight that would carry. I remember saying I wasn't totally sure, but in court it felt like everyone needed me to be sure. So I was, or I tried to be. If my words kept an innocent man in prison for 15 years, I have to fix that, even if it means admitting I was wrong." She agreed to sign an affidavit, recanting her identification and explaining in detail how her initial uncertainty had been transformed into courtroom certainty through time, repetition, and subtle pressures. She understood the risks. Recantation could expose her to perjury charges, could subject her to public criticism, could force her to relive the trauma yet again. She did it anyway. By the time the evidentiary hearing convened, the same hearing where we began, 3 pieces of new evidence were before Judge Keystone: Juniper's DNA report, excluding Rook and implicating Pike, Eden's recantation affidavit, and expert testimony on memory and identification procedures. The mystery from the original trial, the missing DNA under her nails, was about to be resolved in a way that would unravel the case entirely. In the courtroom that day, North's case unfolded in deliberate steps, each tied to a specific legal mechanism. First, she called analyst Juniper. Juniper explained the testing process in plain language. She described how STR analysis works, how certain regions of DNA, short tandem repeats, vary in length from person to person, making them useful for identification. She walked through chain of custody, from hospital to police property to Arcadia Labs freezer and finally to her workbench. She emphasized that the kit seals had been intact, that she had used separate gloves and instruments for each sample, and that lab protocols included negative controls to detect contamination. No contamination had been detected. All controls were clean. "Did you compare the DNA profile from the vaginal swabs to a known sample from Mr. Rook?" North asked. "Yes," Juniper replied. "They did not match at any of the loci tested. In fact, at multiple loci, Mr. Rook's alleles were completely different from the alleles in the crime scene profile. Statistically, he is excluded as the source." "Did you enter the crime scene profile into the state offender database?" "Yes. The profile matched an existing offender, Offender Pike, at all loci tested. The random match probability for this profile, that is, the chance that a randomly selected unrelated individual would have the same profile, is approximately 1 in several quintillions." Prosecutor Hale stood to cross-examine. It was his job to test the evidence, even if his office had already felt the tide turning. He asked about degradation. Could the DNA have been degraded over 15 years in storage? Juniper explained that proper freezing preserves DNA well, and that the clarity of the profile indicated high-quality, intact DNA. He asked about allelic dropout and mixtures. She noted that the main profile was single-source male. He pressed on CODIS. Is it possible that this match to offender Pike is just a coincidence? Juniper answered calmly. The statistical odds are astronomically low. In practical terms, it is not reasonably possible that this profile belongs to anyone other than Mr. Pike. Next, North called Eden. The courtroom was so quiet as Eden took the stand that the scratch of the court reporter's pen sounded like sandpaper. North approached carefully. She needed the truth without making Eden feel attacked. Ms. Eden, North said softly, 15 years ago you testified in this courtroom and identified Mr. Rook as the man who assaulted you. Have your feelings about that identification changed? Eden swallowed. Yes, she said. They have. Can you tell the court why? When I first saw the photo array, I was still in shock. Detective Harbour told me they had a suspect. He said the person might or might not be in the photos, but it felt like a test I was supposed to pass. She glanced briefly at Rook, then away. I picked Mr. Rook's photo because it seemed closest to what I remembered, but I told the detective I wasn't completely sure. Over time, the police and the prosecutor talked to me a lot. They said things like, "You're brave for identifying him, and we know he's the one, and now the jury needs to hear it." By the time of trial, I had repeated that story so many times that it felt solid. I convinced myself I was certain. North nodded. And what changed? When I learned about the DNA, Eden said, her voice cracking. When I read that the DNA in my kit and under my nails belonged to someone else, offender Pike, not Mr. Rook, I realized that my certainty had been wrong. I never saw my attacker's face clearly. I recognized the feeling the system wanted from me, certainty, and I gave it. I wish I hadn't. I wish they had told me it was okay not to know. Did anyone ever threaten you or tell you explicitly to lie? North asked. No, Eden said. No one said pick him, but they did say they already had their guy, and after everything that happened to me, I wanted the nightmare to be over. I thought helping them would help me. The prosecutor Hale rose, but then sat back down, shaking his head. No questions, he said quietly. Finally, North called expert Lumen, who testified about the limitations of eyewitness memory, especially under high stress and poor lighting, and about how non-blind simultaneous lineups can subtly steer witnesses toward the suspect even without explicit coaching. Lumen explained phenomena like relative judgment, choosing the person who looks most like the memory rather than making an absolute identification, and the malleability of confidence over time. Confidence at trial is a poor indicator of accuracy, Lumen said. By then, witnesses have had their memories reinforced through interviews and feedback. When North rested, the legal record was clear. The core pillars of the original conviction, Eden's identification and Rook's supposed proximity, were no longer trustworthy. The DNA evidence did more than poke holes. It positively pointed to another perpetrator. The law, through mechanisms like the actual innocence gateway and standards for newly discovered evidence, provided a path to undo the conviction. Prosecutor Hale stood. For a moment, it seemed he might argue, dig in, defend the old verdict. Instead, he took a breath. "Your Honor," he said, "the state does not and cannot dispute the DNA evidence. It conclusively excludes Mr. Rook as the source of the biological material central to this offense and implicates offender Pike, who has already been convicted of an eerily similar crime. Ms. Eden's recantation is corroborated by this science and by the expert testimony on identification reliability. In light of this, the state joins the defense in moving to vacate Mr. Rook's conviction. Furthermore, given the evidence, the state will not retry this case and will move to dismiss all charges with prejudice." Those last two words, "with prejudice," meant the case would be closed for good. No retrial, no lingering threat of a new indictment. Judge Keystone looked over the rim of his glasses at Rook. "Mr. Rook, please stand." Rook rose, knees unsteady. "This court finds," Keystone said, his voice steady but softer than at sentencing 15 years earlier, "that the newly discovered DNA evidence, in combination with the recantation of the key eyewitness and the expert testimony presented, establishes your actual innocence by clear and convincing evidence. Your conviction is hereby vacated. The charges against you are dismissed with prejudice. You are ordered released from custody forthwith." For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the air in the courtroom seemed to shift. North put a hand on Rook's arm. Eden dropped her face into her hands. One of the law students exhaled audibly. The reporter in the back scribbled furiously. In the hallway afterward, amid hugs and handshakes and hurried statements, the practical machinery of freedom began to grind into motion. A deputy from the Department of Corrections escorted Rook not back to Iron Ridge, but to a small processing office. There, a corrections clerk opened a steel cabinet and pulled out a sealed plastic bag containing the clothes Rook had worn on the day of his arrest. Jeans, a faded t-shirt, sneakers. They smelled faintly musty from years in storage, a ghost of his old life captured in fabric. He changed in a small restroom, the beige walls closing in around him. The jeans were tight at the waist. His body had changed. The shirt hung differently on his shoulders. He looked at himself in the mirror. Older face, lines at the corners of his eyes, hair threaded with grey, and for a moment he didn't recognize the man staring back. Back in the clerk's office, he signed a stack of forms: acknowledgement of release, property inventory, a form confirming that he'd received a copy of the court order. One form was more insidious, a release of claims the department sometimes slipped in, attempting to get exonerees to waive their rights to sue in exchange for expedited release. North saw it and slid it aside. "You don't sign this," she said quietly. "The statute entitles you to compensation. We're not giving that up." Outside the courthouse, the air felt different than it had in the holding pens and visiting yards, even though it was technically the same oxygen. It was colder than he'd imagined. The sky over Riverbend was a hard, bright blue. The city sounded alive, traffic humming, a bus braking, someone laughing as they walked past. Rook stood on the steps, blinking like someone stepping out of a cave. North walked him to her car, a compact hatchback that bore the dust and coffee cups of a busy practice. On the way, she explained the next steps in legal terms, translated to human consequences. "First, compensation," she said. "Under the state's wrongful conviction statute, you're eligible for $50,000 per year of wrongful imprisonment, up to a cap of $750,000. You did 15 years, so you hit the cap. We'll need to file a claim with the State Claims Board, attach the court's order, the DNA reports, and some documentation of what you've lost. Employment opportunities, family impacts. It takes time, and they sometimes push back. But your case is strong." He nodded, not entirely grasping the numbers. After 15 years of making 23 cents an hour in the laundry, $750,000 was an abstraction. "Second, expungement," she continued. "Even though your conviction is vacated, the arrest and original charges still show up in databases. We'll file a separate petition to expunge the record. The standard is usually met for people who have been exonerated, but there are hearings and timelines. Once it's granted, background checks won't show that you were ever convicted. That matters for work, housing, all of it." They drove to a small motel on the edge of Riverbend, the kind with a buzzing sign and a front desk behind bulletproof glass. A local re-entry non-profit, Horizon Bridge, had arranged for a few weeks of lodging and a small stipend, part of a program that recognized how hard release could be, even when it was joyous. The motel room was simple: 2 beds, a television, a small table, but to Rook it felt almost surreal. No bars on the windows, no constant overhead announcements. He sat on the bed, hands on his knees. What now? He asked. Now you rest, North said. You call whoever you want to call. Tomorrow we go to the DMV to get you a new ID. Then we meet with the people at Horizon Bridge. They'll help with the phone, maybe clothes, job training. We'll also start the paperwork for compensation and expungement. It's a lot, but we'll take it one step at a time. He nodded again. After she left, he stared at the phone on the nightstand for a long time before picking it up. The numbers felt unfamiliar under his fingers as he dialed his sister's last known number. The line rang and then clicked. "Hello?" a woman's voice said, older but definitely Mara. "It's me," he said. "It's Rook." "Yeah?" There was a silence that stretched so long he could hear his own breathing, then a sob. They said you were—" "I'm out," he said. I didn't do it. They finally believed me." Her words tumbled out in fits and starts. She apologized for the years of silence, explained about her son, about the move, about the way it hurt too much to see him behind glass. He listened, tears in his own eyes, feeling something inside him both heal and ache at once. In the months that followed, the abstract mechanisms of law translated into concrete obstacles and opportunities. The compensation process required a detailed application. North gathered records, prison disciplinary reports. Rook had few. His work history inside, letters from chaplains and counselors attesting to his conduct, documentation of familial losses. The State Claims Board scheduled a hearing. Rook sat in another panelled room, telling strangers in suits about the years he had missed, his mother's funeral, his nephew's childhood, countless ordinary days. The board approved the maximum award. The money came in 2 installments, after legal fees and taxes. It allowed him to rent a small apartment, buy basic furniture, and pay for therapy. It did not restore his mother's life or rewind the clock. Expungement took longer. The petition moved through the docket, delayed by an overloaded clerk's office. When the expungement order finally came, it felt oddly anticlimactic. A stamped piece of paper with legalese pronouncing that all records of arrest and conviction in this matter shall be sealed. And yet that sealing mattered. When he applied for a job at a warehouse, the background check did not flag him as a felon. The hiring manager still asked about the 15-year gap in his work history. But the conversation was different when Rook could say, "I was wrongfully convicted and later exonerated," and hand over a newspaper article explaining the case. Getting hired was still not easy. Some employers saw exonerated and heard complicated. But eventually, one did hire him, Warehouse Alder, a mid-sized logistics company whose owner had a brother who'd spent time in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Rook started on the loading dock, arranging pallets. The rhythm of physical work felt familiar, almost comforting. Machines made sense. They did what physics dictated, not what flawed human memories insisted. Emotionally, release was not a simple miracle. Nights were hard. He woke sometimes to phantom noises, metallic clangs, shouted counts, only to find himself in his small, quiet bedroom. Crowds made him anxious. Years of watching his back in close quarters had trained his nervous system to view any cluster of strangers as a potential threat. Therapy helped, slowly. So did time. He stayed in touch with North, who became not just his lawyer, but a friend of sorts. They spoke about more than his case, books, news, the small frustrations of ordinary life. He also met with Eden once, at her request, in a mediated setting. It was awkward and painful. She apologized. He listened. "I can't ask you to forgive me," she said, eyes red. "What I did, what I said, helped put you in there." "You didn't do it by yourself," he replied. "There were a lot of people who could have done things differently. I was angry at you for a long time. I still don't know what to do with that, but I know you went through hell too. I don't want you to live there forever either." They left it there. Not friends, not exactly reconciled, but no longer bound only by a false narrative. In the wake of his exoneration, Granite County and the state made several changes, codifying lessons from his case so they wouldn't be lost when headlines faded. Lawmakers passed a statute mandating recording, audio or video, of all custodial interrogations in serious felony cases, not just homicides. They adopted statewide guidelines for eyewitness identification procedures, double-blind administration, the officer showing the photos doesn't know who the suspect is, sequential presentation, one photo at a time rather than all at once, and standardized instructions emphasizing that the suspect may or may not be present and that it is perfectly acceptable to say, "I don't know." The Arcadia lab used his case in internal training on kit backlogs and testing triage. They implemented a policy that any sexual assault kit associated with a case lacking DNA testing but involving a stranger assailant would be flagged for possible testing, even post-conviction. Perhaps most quietly, but most importantly, the DA's office instituted an internal conviction integrity unit. Prosecutor Hale, chastened by the case, supported the creation of a small team of prosecutors and investigators whose job was to review claims of innocence with fresh eyes, particularly where biological evidence had been untested or where informant testimony and questionable forensic techniques had played key roles. For Rook, these reforms were both heartening and bittersweet. They meant fewer people might go through what he had. They also underscored that his suffering was avoidable. Had his original request for DNA testing been granted? Had the lab prioritized the kit? Had the lineup been administered differently? His life might have unfolded in a radically different way. Years after his release, his life settled into a quieter pattern. He worked the early shift at Warehouse Alder, then spent afternoons volunteering at Horizon Bridge. He sat on panels where exonerees spoke to law students and new prosecutors about wrongful convictions. Sometimes he stood in front of a lecture hall and told his story, the legal terms now mixed seamlessly with human details. He spoke about chain of custody not as an abstract concept, but as the reason a sealed box in a freezer could save a life years later. He explained how post-conviction DNA statutes worked, that they weren't automatic get-out-of-jail-free cards, but narrow pathways that required evidence to have been preserved and technology to have advanced. He talked about actual innocence gateways as the thin legal bridge that allowed courts to look past procedural defaults and consider the merits of a claim when the risk of a grave injustice was too high to ignore. He also talked about how easily the system had overlooked the one thing that never fit, the fingernail scrapings that went untested, the victim's initial uncertainty that went unrecorded, the absence of any physical evidence tying him to the crime. He described how each institution, police, prosecutors, courts, labs, defense, had made choices that, individually, seemed justifiable, but collectively added up to a wrongful conviction. Occasionally, he would meet young cops or prosecutors afterward who looked uncomfortable, even defensive. "We're not like that," they'd say. "We follow the rules." He would answer, "So did most of the people in my case." The problem wasn't a villain twirling a mustache. It was people trusting bad procedures and overestimating how good we are at knowing what's true. On a cool autumn morning, years after the hearing that set him free, Rook woke before dawn in his small one-bedroom apartment. He moved through his usual routine, coffee, a shower, checking the news on his phone. On the kitchen table, next to a simple mug, sat a cardboard evidence box. North had picked it up from the courthouse archives after the expungement and brought it over with a quiet formality. "This is everything that used to define you in the eyes of the state," she'd said. "You can keep it, burn it, put it in a closet, whatever you want." For weeks, he had left the box sealed. He wasn't sure whether opening it would be catharsis or reopening a wound. On this morning, as the first pale light seeped through the blinds and the city outside yawned into motion, he reached for the tape. He paused, fingers resting on the cardboard edge. In the silence of the early hour, He could hear faint traffic, a distant dog barking, the heating system clicking on, no clang of bars, no shouted counts, just the ordinary sounds of a city where, for the first time since he was 28, he was free to choose what his day would be. He let his hand fall away from the box. Not yet, he decided. The papers inside, the transcripts, the police reports, the lab printouts would still be there tomorrow and the day after. For now, it was enough to sit at the table, feel the warmth of the coffee cup, and look at an unopened evidence box that no longer had the power to hold him. If you've stayed with this story to the end, it means you care about how justice can fail and how it can be repaired. Consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts below. Every comment, every conversation helps keep these hard-earned lessons from being forgotten.